Thank you very much, Ludgers, for this nice introduction. I'm very happy to be here just to share my views with this title, The Impact of COVID-19 on Irregular Migrant Workers. Yes, as I said that I will focus on the impact of COVID-19 on irregular migrant workers. Actually, I will talk about a bit the case, some specific case in Turkey, but I will try to develop a kind of general framework how we can understand the impact of COVID-19 on irregular migrant workers. Even before that, I will focus on a bit the impact of the crisis, different type of crisis actually in over the migrant workers. But let me start just mentioning two things. The first with this slide, what we know with the COVID-19 is that this is very unusual. It is a very unusual development that since the maybe invention of the nation states, first time around the world globally, first time in history, almost all countries somehow took measures to close their borders. Some of them a kind of full closure, the others partial closure, but this map on the left shows that the almost very few countries exception with different reasons, but almost all countries closed their borders. And this affected the what I will explain the how we define them, irregular migrant workers. They make this closure made very vulnerable. As this is the first point. So the second point is related to irregular migrant workers. Although the nation state countries, the states are not so happy with the irregular or quote unquote nation states call them as illegal migrant workers. As the migration scholars, we don't like it. But the irregular migrant workers are very integral part of the world economy. We should also stress that. For instance, on the right side of this slide, you see that this is in fact almost official figure of course, counting the irregular migrants is not so possible, but these are the estimations. In US, in the last 2 decades, we know that as a pool, or more than 10 million undocumented migrants. Maybe here I should stress that we use different terms, particularly in Northern America, they call it as undocumented. In Europe, around here, we call them as irregulars, and the officials or more official concept is a kind of quote-unquote illegal migrants. What we mean that in fact, these are the unregistered people, either unregistered in terms of border crossing or unregistered in terms of their work permit. So, but we are talking also, even time to time, refugees or some other type of migrants become irregular because of the process of getting work permit or the visa. So we are talking about a kind of quite large number of people. In fact, in Europe, I'm always doubtful about these figures, but one mentioned this, even the experts mentioned the millions of irregulars in Europe and other parts of the world. So what I like to do in this presentation, first, I will develop this introduction. Then I will link to this COVID issue and the irregular migrant workers. Then I will give some cases from history and current cases. And at that stage, I will come to also Turkey. Particularly in this presentation, also, I will draw your attention to the return question of what we call the stranded irregular migrants. What happened, as I explained in the first slide, when the countries close their borders, these people, they are stuck there, okay? They cannot easily go back. They cannot go back. But although some of them, they wish to go because of their conditions. So then I will draw some lessons from past and current studies, particularly as an issue of policy making, what we can suggest. And the taking is a kind of issue of global governance, how we can manage that, how the countries or international organizations can manage this issue. So as this will be a kind of repetition, but the COVID-19 environment having impact over all of us, all corners of the world, but its impact not uniform. Neither the country is equally affected nor the people. So certain populations are more affected, the others less. For instance, what is considered that the immigrants and refugees, they are more affected than the native born population. Even demographically, we know that the elderly people, they are more affected, and in terms of class, probably poor people are more affected than the rich and others. So I already give the definition what we mean with the irregular. So there's a large group of people in different parts of the world, and they face with different challenges and vulnerabilities because of the conditions of the COVID-19. As I said, they are locked in and locked out. They cannot move. And then we need a kind of management of this question. And what could be my conclusion could be a kind of how we should think about how we can produce a kind of good global governance out of this picture. Already I noted that the countries, they are not so happy. When we look at the literature, of course, the states legally, they are not happy with the presence of the irregular migrants. This is considered something against law, that they call illegal. But as I stressed at the beginning, they are really very integral part of the national economies, from domestic work to the textile, from food industry to tourism, construction, every part of the world. We see the presence of the irregular migrant workers. Because of this unregistered status, they are very much open to the exploitation by employers, working into these 3D jobs, difficult, dirty jobs. Then they cannot organize themselves easily. It's more difficult to raise their voices, to improve their conditions, because going into a kind of joint action. Plus, always they carry the risk of deportation. Since they are carrying the risk of deportation, they should get well with the employers and the states, so they cannot go around in that sense. Few words about in the general environment of the COVID-19. As we know that the COVID-19 is a global health issue, we call it pandemic in that sense. But when it emerges as a global health issue, also it's emerged as a global border issue. Partly as a reality, as I mentioned, the borders are closed, but also based on this understanding, politicians constructed, not only the politicians, but people on the street, even the scholars, there's a construction of this border issue around COVID-19. Basically, how we can link the COVID-19 and the irregular migrants. First, of course, the issue of access to preventive or care services, health services, since they are unregistered. Of course, in some countries, I was going to say many, but some countries, even if you are irregular migrants, you may have the same chance to go to health services, but you should imagine that this differs from one country to another. Also, it's very risky again. So this is the first thing we can argue, that they cannot easily access to the health service. Second thing is that the COVID-19 affected them, as many also other native populations, workers, they lost their jobs, or also they are losing their jobs. Think about, for instance, particularly female domestic workers, when the family is in time to time, but because of the health reasons, they may say that, look, we are not working with you. So not only them in different industries, they lost their jobs, plus not only jobs, their housing, as I give the example of the domestic workers. And some of them, under these conditions, they may like to return to home. Particularly, I will come to the COVID issue, but in different type of crisis situation, think about, I will give some examples from the war situation. If there is a war in the country or a kind of disaster, environmental disaster, even if you are happy there, but you may like to go out to your own country. So again, in the COVID environment, we have the border restrictions, so you cannot go home. This becomes a very big issue. I will stress this issue actually, because this becomes a very big issue in different parts of the world. And I will play with the example of interesting case of the Armenian workers in Turkey. This will be my case study a bit to elaborate the issue. And what I argue that then this issue becomes a kind of global governance issue. So globally, different involved states, international organizations like the UNHCR or International Organization for Migration or other organizations, and the civil society groups should collaborate to provide some solution to the situation of the irregular migrants stranded, blocked in a country. So now I like to give some historical examples how the different crises affected them. In general, migrant workers, but also we can draw the lessons for the irregular migrants. As I said, that we can think of different crises, like the uprising, like the Arab Spring, or armed conflict, like I will mention the 1990-91 Gulf War between Iraq and the Kuwait, or like pandemics we are experiencing in the COVID-19. The first example give quickly, which is the Gulf War. First, what happened that in the Gulf War, Iraq occupied the Kuwait, there was a war, then the other countries involved, but there were many foreign workers both in Iraq and Kuwait in 1990-91. And I remember from those days, and also from the literature, even I have written on that, they cannot go out. Even those countries, for instance, Iraq prevented them to go, some of the foreign workers, because they were functional for their economy, and both Kuwait and Iraq. So at 1991, actually almost, or late 1990s, almost 60,000 foreign workers. First, what they did, they came to Turkey, because Turkey has a border with Iraq, just to go home. And what is needed, that a kind of international operation. Their home countries, they sent planes, and the international organizations helped them, etc. Same type of situation we witnessed in the so-called Arab Spring. Thousands of foreign workers, they stranded in Egypt, Libya, or Tunisia. Then there was need for the international operations to save them, to get them out of this crisis situation. And what these cases taught us, that again, I'm stressing over, and I will stress, there's need for the collaboration between the involved state, international organizations, intergovernmental organizations, UN organizations, and the different NGOs, both established by the migrants or native people or internationally. Now coming to the present cases, how the particularly COVID affected the case of irregular migrant workers in general, and specifically also irregulars. We witnessed that as you know, that the Gulf countries, these oil-rich countries, they are hosting hundreds of thousands of the workers particularly from India and Pakistan and the Philippines and other parts of the world. Even those countries, of course, they are hosting the professionals from different countries. But mostly what happened, that particularly Indian and Pakistani workers in Gulf countries, they started suffering. That when I look at the news, almost 200,000 of them, they wanted to leave the country, both from both India and Pakistan, 200,000, because those embassies, they tried to get a kind of list of the people, but only tens of flights they were possible to take them from these Gulf countries to either to India or Pakistan. It needed a big operation. And in fact, there was a very specific case, for instance. These are the news, of course. I mean, in that stage, I don't have a kind of opportunity to have a kind of direct research, but as I collected news, that even in the case of Pakistan and India, when they arrive at home countries, for instance, they have to pay this flight cost, plus there's this 14 days quarantine. Also, they have to pay the quarantine accommodation cost and food, etc. So this creates a kind of how problematic is the whole issue that shows. So what I call that, this is a kind of situation of locked in and locked out. You are locked in somewhere, but you cannot go out too. Now I will highlight the 3 cases, and I will elaborate more the case of Armenian irregular workers in Turkey. Again, when I look at what is written in the last 2-3 months, for instance, you know that in last couple of years, there's a Venezuelan migrants moving from Venezuela to the neighboring countries. We observe the same type of crisis actually in Ecuador, Colombia, or other neighboring countries. Venezuelan migrants, they want to go back. Some of these countries, they are neighboring countries to Venezuela. They were able to, some of them walk to the borders, but which was not so easy because they were in the inlands. So again, this created a kind of tension problem for them. And there were governments collaborated, and the international organizations they were in. This became again a kind of issue there. This becomes another issue for the transit migrants. As you know that how we call the transit migrants, if the migrants using another country as a transit place to go to the third places, like Turkey also, for instance, for some group of migrants, it's a transit country. So in the case of these transit migrants, also those transit countries could be a kind of place where they are stranded, they are locked in and locked out. This was the case of the Ethiopian transit migrants in Somalia, because many Ethiopians, they like to go to the Gulf countries, passing through the Somalia, and it became a kind of issue. Now, I will come to my case, but I will not elaborate too much because I'm currently writing a kind of paper. I don't want to disclose that, but I will play with that. This is a very interesting case of the Armenian irregular migrant workers. It's less known, but it's very interesting case. As you know that these are the photos in Istanbul. They come in the last 2-3 decades. They come to Turkey, and they work in different industries, different area of the economy. But let me explain how it is. As you know that because of the political question, there is no diplomatic relation between Armenia and Turkey is neighboring. We have a border. But actually, when first Armenia declared the independence from the Soviet Union, Turkey accepted as a kind of, there was a recognition of Armenia, but because of the political reasons, then probably last 3 decades, the border is closed. So there's no border crossing there. But what happens that there are, interestingly, when we think about these complicated political issues, until recently, there was a direct flight between a private Turkish Airlines, Atlas, flying between Istanbul and Yerevan. Because of the economic crisis before the COVID-19, there was a bankruptcy in the company. They couldn't fly, but for a long time they fly. So easily they can come. And the Turkish citizens also, they can go to, you can get the visa in the airport, and the same applies to Armenians. So there's a kind of connections, although there's no diplomatic relation and no open border. And often they use also Georgia, a kind of transit base, they go to Georgia, because from Georgia they can pass through Turkey. And over the last 2-3 decades, we know that these are irregular migrants. They are not registered. They came to Turkey with the tourist visa, but they work. There's a pool of almost 10,000, even sometimes they give the larger numbers of the Armenian workers in Turkey. Usually they go into the domestic, females, they go to the domestic sector, but different service sectors, restaurants, plus the construction and the other textile industry in Istanbul. So, and this is well known. So what happened to them when the COVID-19 just happened, and the border closed between Georgia and Turkey, and there's no already border between Armenia and the Yerevan is closed. But we know that not all of them. We should not argue that this is an important footnote. we should not think that all these irregular migrants at the time of crisis, they want to go home, okay? But some portion they want to go home, but that is not possible. Then there was a kind of negotiation between, there's no direct, this is called a kind of backdoor diplomacy through the Georgia. They provided, even there was a communication between the head of the Armenian church in Turkey and President Erdogan, etc. And they arranged a kind of facility. They organized some buses going from Istanbul to the Georgian border. Then the Georgian border was also closed. Through the help of the Georgian border, they opened, and there were, as I gathered, that the 10 different services of the buses just connected these people from Istanbul to Armenia. But what is the lessons from here? Actually, I will come to in the conclusion that we need a kind of complicated structure of negotiation between, not only between states, between NGOs, non-governmental organizations, like the church, for instance, in some civil society, or this church considered as a part of the civil society also. So they involved in some Turkish NGOs, some Armenian groups they involved in, even international organizations. So there was a kind of operation organized. We see this type of organizations with those cases historically also I mentioned earlier. Now, coming a bit to what type of lessons, general lessons we can draw from these cases. One is that although there's need for the international cooperation, there's a failure of the international cooperation. Not only recent case, I'm not only COVID case I'm talking about. In general, international cooperation, because particularly COVID, what we witnessed with the COVID, that naturally, most of the nations, most of the states, first they give their priorities to their citizens, okay? So to the national concerns increase. And we know that also cooperation in the field of international migration, last couple of decades show us that it's a difficult field. Although we see the cooperation, but the nation states, even one can argue that increasingly they are becoming reluctant to go to the international cooperation. What I observed that the concept of goodwill, when I look at the documents or discourses, it is said that the goodwill of the states, goodwill of them. So there's an informal discourse around this issue. I like to stress that there is a convention on migrant workers, 1990 actually designed. Only 39 countries sign it. No countries from the global north. And this is the only main document which looks at internationally to the case of migrant workers. There's a reference to irregulars, but very limited. But there is no detailed discussion in this international convention. So this means that what I'm arguing, that the really international arena is kind of poor to provide a kind of good services to this question. What we can draw another lesson is that the host countries, naturally, they are obliged to provide possible maximum care in the disaster situation like the COVID-19 situation. But in some crisis situation, also this is very difficult, even in the COVID-19, as I said, that the national concerns, in fact, they were very central to the policies. And if national governments wants to do something for particularly those irregulars or temporary workers, this became a kind of secondary issue. Coming to this specific discussion on when the irregular migrants stranded, when they are locked in and locked out, although they want to go home, but they cannot go. So there is issue of, now I'm coming to the specific issue of the COVID period. So they need first exit visa, a kind of official arrangement. You should open the border, they can go. Second issue is very much discussed in those cases, financing of these trips. National governments, they try, but time to time they, of course, they don't provide free tickets to those people, So this becomes again a kind of issue there. Another important conclusion I can draw from this stranded cases of the irregular migrants, role of the neighboring countries. Because if the home country is far from the host country, of course you need only flights in this type of situation. You cannot go just directly. So flight, the air travel is only option. But if the people coming from the neighboring country, that's relatively easy. But neighboring countries also play a role particularly if the host country cannot manage, the neighboring country can open the borders and these people can come back from the neighboring country. One can arrange a kind of relief of these people, as I give the example of Turkey in the Gulf War period. And over, I argue that really we need a kind of quite big operation of the involved nation states, international or intergovernmental organizations, and the NGOs. Now, towards the end of my talk, I'm coming to the need of what I call the need of good global governance. In the literature, what we know with the global governance is that very briefly, I will explain some of the issues becomes, I will very simply, simple description. If there's a kind of global issue affecting different countries, we argue that this could be a kind of, we need global governance, global management issue. Like the migration is a kind of global governance issue, or environmental issues, global governance issue, or trade. And when we look at the global governance literature, I'm again stressing the same things. We have the three main actors. One is that the states, but different states involved. Second, intergovernmental organization, UN or others, or civil society organization, or national or international civil society organizations, also representing the people. Those people, they are having the problem too, or different groups of people, the civil society organizations. In this literature, what I argue that there's a kind of top-down or bottom-up approach. Either they say that the civil society organizations should highlight this issue, then the states should respond, states and the international organizations, or a kind of this bottom-up approach, or top-down is that the governments or the particularly international organizations, they may bring the issue to the desk, then the other related actors may involve. I will argue that this is a fine. Actually, we have these three actors, but we have, and I call it this a widening part of the global governance. But we should think about the kind of deepening of the good global governance, taking the global governance as a kind of policy design. What I mean is that I took this from the field of the policy science. In the literature, there's a discussion that we should look at any policy design with the three dimensions. One is the structures. Structure means that the broader material and cultural context. We can think of the political and social culture where these different institutions and different actors operate. When we come to institutions, apart from the sociological literature and political science, here we are referring to only the formal or informal rules that informs the actors. So regulations are important. That's the reason I give the 1990 convention example. Then we can think of the actors or agencies. So individuals, organizations, states, international organizations, NGOs could be actors here. So what I suggest that really to have a kind of good governance understanding and the good governance policy design, we have to look at this both structures, institutions, and agencies operating in the field. As for instance, let me give an example. For instance, structure. I give this example that the Armenian workers in Turkey. What is needed that a type of understanding. There's no official connection between countries. Then our broader, that there's a conflict area, but apparently For instance, church in Armenian church in Turkey, presidency in Turkey, somehow in that sense, they created a kind of environment they can cooperate each other. That's what I mean. Then, although there is no formal rules and regulations, then different actors came together and they act accordingly. I'm just last two slides to come to the conclusion. Some of them will be repetition. What we already argued, that there are group of migrants. They are very vulnerable and they are exploited. The case of irregular migrants gives us that, and they are this type of migrants. They are less protected by the states and international organizations, so they are vulnerable. Second issue is that the migration-related issues, as we see, that they always globally reach. So it's a global issue, and we need a kind of new management and protection challenges, as COVID-19 also show us. In the environment of crisis, national governments become a bit inward-looking, a bit conservative. We should also observe that. Secondly, so I argue that this main argument, we should look at from the point of good global governance. My last slide will be a bit food for thought. Indirectly, I drove this issue from my discussion and referring to other. What we know, what we understand, that with the COVID-19, particularly when we look at those irregular migrant workers, they create a field of risk, but they create also a field of opportunity. Why I mentioned that in many countries around, particularly in Europe and in North America, we understood that in the time of crisis like COVID, food security and food chain, providing food became very important. And what we know that in general, migrant workers, seasonal workers, including the irregular ones, very active in the food industry. They are very functional in the food security and food chain. So looking from that perspective, this became a kind of issue. You know that even some countries, not to the irregulars, but for the seasonal workers, there's now specific arrangements to open the borders. But the conclusion from here, that I think we need a kind of rethinking of how the whole issue of migration, how it is related to the economy, our lives, and the migrant workers very functional. Even the irregular migrant workers they are very functional for our economies. This is the reason that the time to time we know that the countries they do amnesties, regularization process. Now it is discussed in Italy these days. I think there will be a kind of regularization process. Well, thank you very much. This was my lecture.